Hey, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into something that feels, well, both super complicated and way too common, the US government shutdown. So let's just get right into it. I mean, it sounds pretty dramatic, doesn't it? But really, that's the core question here. So what is a government shutdown? Well, it's what happens when Congress just can't agree on the funding bills that keep the whole federal government up and running. But how does that even happen? How can a government just run out of money? Okay, so first things first, we need to be clear the government isn't actually broke. It still has money coming in. A shutdown happens because of what's called a funding gap. It's basically a political problem, a failure to give permission to spend the money that's already there. And you're going to hear this term a lot, non-essential. That's the key. It means a ton of services get cut back, and hundreds of thousands of federal employees are basically told, hey, stay home and you're not getting paid. So, to really get why this all happens, we've got to take a quick look at how the government is supposed to get its money in the first place. It really all boils down to one simple but super important principle. Congress controls the money. The US Constitution gives them what's called the power of the purse. And that means not a single dollar can be spent from the Treasury unless Congress passes a law saying, go for it. The president can't just write a check. Simple as that. Now, in a perfect world, the process is actually pretty straightforward. Congress is supposed to pass 12 separate appropriations bills. That's just a fancy word for funding bills for all the different parts of the government. One for defense, one for agriculture, and so on. Ideally, the House passes them, the Senate passes them, and the president signs them all into law before the fiscal year ends on October 1st. But, well, that's in a perfect world, right? And this is exactly where the trouble starts. You get these big political fights over how much to spend. Or maybe one party tries to attach a controversial policy to a funding bill, and the whole thing just grinds to a halt. When that October 1st deadline comes and goes with no deal, boom, you've got a funding gap. And this brings us to a really crucial point. A shutdown isn't actually a choice. There's this old law from way back in the 1870s called the Anti-Deficiency Act, and it makes it flat out illegal for federal officials to spend money that Congress hasn't approved. Thanks to how that law has been interpreted in the last few decades, it means that when the funding runs out, they are legally required to shut down most of their operations. Their hands are literally tied. So, you might be thinking, this is just a bunch of political drama in Washington, D.C., right? Wrong. The consequences create this massive ripple effect that touches pretty much the entire country. First off, it's important to know that not everything shuts down. Anything considered essential for protecting life and property keeps going. So, the active duty military stays on the job, air traffic controllers are still in the towers, keeping planes flying, and yeah, your mail still gets delivered. That's because the Postal Service actually funds itself. But a huge part of the government does close. Were you thinking of visiting a national park this weekend? Or a Smithsonian museum? Sorry, they're closed. Need to get a passport processed? You can expect some serious delays. All that crucial scientific research, it gets paused. And of course, hundreds of thousands of civilian federal employees are furloughed. And the human impact here is just immense. Let's just take the 2013 shutdown as an example. It went on for 16 days, and during that time, 800,000 federal employees were furloughed. That means they were sent home with absolutely no idea when their next paycheck was going to arrive. And the cost to the whole economy, it's staggering. I mean, just look at the 35-day shutdown back in 2018-2019. It wiped an estimated $11 billion from the U.S. economy. And get this, the Congressional Budget Office said that $3 billion of that was just gone. It never came back. It was economic activity that was lost forever. But, beyond these huge abstract numbers, the human cost is just devastating. This quote from the 2025 crisis really hits it home. It shows how these shutdowns directly threaten programs like SNAP. That's the food assistance program that millions of families rely on. And that kind of direct personal impact brings us right to the most recent major standoff. So everything we've been talking about, it's not just theory. It all played out in real time during the big 2025 shutdown. Yeah, the 2025 shutdown, it actually became the longest in U.S. history. It lasted over 38 days, and the impacts just got worse and worse as it went on. So what was the big fight about that time? Well, it really all boiled down to a major fight over healthcare policy. On one side, you had Republicans saying, hey, let's just pass a temporary funding bill, what's called a continuing resolution, to get the government open again, and we can argue about the other stuff later. But on the Democratic side, the position was, nope, Any funding bill has to include an extension for the Affordable Care Act subsidies, which help millions of people afford health insurance. It was just a classic, high-stakes political standoff. And we saw the consequences in real time. Remember how we said air traffic controllers are considered essential? Well, they are, but they were also working without pay. And what happened? The FAA started reporting that more and more of them were calling out sick, and that led to thousands of flight delays and cancellations in just a single weekend. But maybe the most urgent crisis was this number, 42 million. That is how many Americans who rely on SNAP benefits were at risk of losing their food assistance because the backup funds were about to run dry. The human stakes of this political fight, they just could not have been higher. So you have to ask, how did we get to this point? Let's zoom out for a second and look at the bigger picture. When you look back at the history, you start to see a really clear pattern. After those big shutdowns back in the mid-90s, they started happening more often, and they started lasting longer. You had 16 days in 2013, then a record-breaking 35 days in 2018-19, and then, of course, the new record set in 2025. What this trend really seems to suggest is that something that used to be seen as a really rare, massive failure of government has now become, well, a routine political weapon. And it leaves us with a really tough question. Is this kind of brinksmanship, where you're using the livelihoods of millions of people as leverage, is this just the new normal in American politics? Thanks for joining us for this explainer.